Hello again. Um, Wanted to make a quick video, hopefully this week, a sort of response to a video I did a few weeks ago on the Dungeons and Dragons Appendix N video. At the time, I was contemplating going through books that had been published since that list of inspirational reading was published, which I believe was like 1979, 1980, somewhere in that vein. Realizing that's 4 decades worth of fantasy literature that was left out. And in spite of the fact that I've been running a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons game for several months now, I did not realize that there are updated lists in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, and actually another list in the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide of inspirational reading for players and dungeon masters, respectively. In reviewing those lists, a lot of what I would have talked about has already been covered. But just to show you what I mean, there are now 2 appendices of inspirational reading. There is the new list for players, which I referred to. See if I can get it in there. Decent enough to see? Yes. Appendix E now, inspirational reading for players. And believe it or not, Appendix D to the Dungeon Master's Guide, inspirational reading for game masters running a Dungeons and Dragons game or campaign. Now, the new players list, Appendix E, is very much like the old list, just expanded. And not just for new literature, there's some older literature that was added back in. I was glad to see. And the Appendix D for Dungeon Masters isn't what I was expecting. There's a little bit about world building, particularly in a medieval setting, but most of what's in Appendix D now is about writing. For instance, Stephen King's classic writing manual on writing is on that list. There are also some strictly game-oriented materials. John Peterson's Gaming at the World is in there. Great thing to see. And also Gary Gygax's books on gaming are both in there. However, I still wanted, after reviewing those lists, to make a few comments about both lists, particularly some things that were left out of both lists. And I have a few of those things here that I wanted to talk about. First off, I ran the same quiz that I did last time, giving myself half a point if I owned a represented author's work from the new Appendix E, and another half point for having read one of those relevant author's works. There was a potential of getting 57 points off of the new list. And I did not fare as well as I did on the old list, which makes sense. My peak reading years were the 80s and 90s. And therefore, there is plenty of stuff out there published in the fantasy genre that I am not familiar with, certainly haven't read. There were quite a few newer books on there that I have either own or have read. But in any event, as I recall, when I did my little self-quiz for Appendix N, I think I got a possible, what was it? I remember it was slightly more than 50%. I'm thinking you could get 29 possible points, and I got 15. So just barely more than half. In the new quiz, you could get potentially get 57 points, if my math is correct, and I only got 24. So a bit less than half this time. Once again, that's to be expected since I have not been as avid a reader in the genre as I was, decades ago. Just the price of getting older and having too many distractions. But first of all, in reviewing the new list, I noticed some things that I think are absent from the list. And of course, you can't include everything in this list. But just a few notable things. This isn't necessarily a critique of the new list, but it are some things that I'd like to just throw out there for discussion. Um, different sources of inspiration for your Dungeons and Dragons game, for both as a player and as a dungeon master. First one I want to talk about is this one. Now, on both the old list and the new list, Fred Saberhagen is there. Fred Saberhagen was a very popular fantasy writer. He's a science fiction writer. You know, going back in the decades from the 60s through the 90s. This was a series that was actively being published throughout the 80s. This is a book club omnibus of the first three novels in what was called the Sword series. And as I recall, the first three books in the complete Book of Swords were very cleverly named the first Book of Swords, second Book of Swords, and the third Book of Swords. Now, the thing being, the premise of this series is that the gods have manufactured 12 magical swords, and they have pictures of their emblems and a representative sword. Just a plain looking sword. The only thing that differentiates it from just any other sword you might find on a battlefield were the emblems. And the 12 swords had 12 very different powers. And the stories often interplayed how those particular powers affected the humans that were given the swords, as well as how the swords' powers interacted with each other. Um, like I said, I thought just an obvious kind of mechanic for a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I've thought more than once about having a swords theme campaign where the gods distribute 12 swords for a game they're playing, manipulating humanity, just to see the drama ensue and see what plays out. As I said, they have the author, but they don't have this particular work, which was always curious because these books, I believe, are being published. If I'm not mistaken, let me check copyright, but I'm pretty sure that the first Book of Swords, nope, first Book of Swords would have been published after the initial Appendix N publication, and they went on forever. I'm thinking 11 novels and a short story collection. I've read them all. Like I say, yeah, this would be a great source of inspiration for a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Now some stuff that they just ignored completely. And this one, I think, is the only one that's a bit troubling for me. And that is the Chronicles of Narnia books by C.S. Lewis. They were not included in the first Appendix N, um, and they are not included in the update, which would not have been as. Oh, and I'm going to, yeah. Would not have been as big a deal to me, except for something that they did include on the new list. On the new list, they included the Prydain series by Lloyd Alexander. Because initially I thought, well, they just don't want to include books aimed at an audience this young. Because the Narnia books are written for middle grade children. So I thought, well, they're wanting more mature fiction. But if you include the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander, there's no reason not to include this. And to my mind, the Narnia books were a lot wider read and a lot more influential, much more adapted in multiple adaptations than the Prydain books. So you wonder, why not? There are all sorts of interesting game elements, story elements to inspire your Dungeons and Dragons game. The one I have read the most, let's pull out Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Starting in my younger years, this is the third, well, to me, the third book in the series. The modernists say it's the fifth. They're wrong. The third book in the series, in order of publication, is a very straightforward quest story. They're hoping to get to Aslan's country at the end of the sea, um, for a variety of motives. But yes, it's a quest adventure with lots of mini adventures along the way. Uh, a lot of interesting magic and fantastic elements. Just great story ideas in this, just in this one alone. Not to mention the other 6 books. And of course, yeah, this is my preferred edition of these books. I've owned a few, but these are the heavy duty full color collector's edition from, oh, who's it from? From Harper, from Harper Collins. And these are the ones that have colorized interior illustrations, as you can tell, are really heavy, really nice stock. Anyway, like I said, just a curiosity to me why you would include certain books for very young readers, but you wouldn't include these. I'll leave my speculations to myself. If you know anything about the writer, C.S. Lewis, you might have some theories. Next off, um, uh, particularly since these are popular today, both to video game crowds and, of course, from the recent adaptations from Netflix, the Witcher books by Andrzej Sapkowski. Fantasy, epic fantasy with a Eastern European twist. These are the short story collections, the first 2 books, The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny. Um, I mean, how can you mess with these sorts of books? Sapkowski writes this huge open world with larger than life characters, fresh new concepts, and drawing upon Eastern European mythology, very interesting new monsters, magic ideas. Um, why not? The Witcher books. And let's see, The Last Wish was published. Ah, no. Okay, first published in English 2007. So well before the publication of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. These could have been included. And it could be that they just weren't as popular then as they are now. Because really, I think the explosion in the awareness of these works was with the last major game release for The Witcher, The Wild Hunt. And that would have came after, probably after publication of the Player's Handbook. But anyway, great ideas for your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Okay. Next, these I know would have been available. That is the Vlad Taltosh books by Stephen Brust. Jarek, Yendi, Tekla, Taltosh. These are the first 4 books. There are now well over a dozen of these things. But this would be good inspirational material for your urban fantasy setting for your Dungeons and Dragons game. Vlad Taltosh. See if we can get a good picture of. Yeah, there's Vlad. Vlad with his familiar Zherig. Zherig is kind of like a pseudo dragon. Um, Vlad Taltosh is an assassin. He is what's called in the game in universe story, an Easterner, because humans are the Dragarians, and the Dragarians I always imagined as kind of a cross between dwarves and elves. Tall as an elf, but kind of built sturdy like a dwarf. And they are the people who dominate this world, or the species that dominate this world. And what we would think of as humans, they call Easterners, or live on the fringes of those empires. In the empire, but they are not the movers and shakers of that empire. And there are, I believe, 17 houses, each named after a creature. And each of the books is named after one of those creatures, like the aforementioned Jarrig. And each house has characteristics kind of linked to that creature. So the the caste in this culture that represents thievery in the underworld are the Jarrig. And that is the class that this guy, Vlad Taltosh, belongs to. Stephen Brust was a kind of a protege of Roger Zelazny, and that's how I kind of came to him. I think the first book I read by him was Terrain in Hell, which is an allegorical retelling of the fall of the angels, which I tend to talk about at some future date in a dedicated video. But like I say, a very interesting fantasy setting, very urban oriented. If you're into that kind of game, these are great inspirational reading for me. And of course, did not make the new Appendix E. And my last thought for an addition to the new Appendix E um, is the Guardians of the Flame series by Joel Rosenberg. There we go. First one, The Sleeping Dragon, with that beautiful Daryl K. Sweet cover art. And the first one was published in, yes, 1983. Um, um, started a little too late to make the original Dungeons and Dragons inspirational reading list, but certainly could have now. Guardians of the Flame series is is based on a trope that has been published quite a few times. This one is the only version of that trope that works for me, and that is the trope that real life human beings in our modern world get transported to their Dungeons and Dragons campaign world. And this is, like I say, maybe it was just because the whole idea was a little too on the nose. But it's very interesting seeing how a group of regular folks, actually in this case college students, how they adapt to becoming their own characters in a fantasy world. I read an essay by Joel Rosenberg where he talked about the original inspiration for this series. And he said he woke screaming because um, he'd had a horrible nightmare, and his wife, was alarmed by it because it was just such a obviously an intense emotional experience for Mr. Rosenberg that she asked him, well, he said, you must have had an awful nightmare. What was it about? And he goes, I dreamed that I was in my Dungeons and Dragons game. And if you think about that for a second, if you've played Dungeons and Dragons for any time at all, you always have that little fantasy. Oh, what would it be like to live in such a world? But if you think about it for long, you realize those worlds are scary, dangerous, awful places that you certainly wouldn't want to dwell in for very long, much less be trapped in them. And that's the premise of these books. And I like to say, I have here the first four: The Sleeping Dragon, The Sword and the Chain, The Silver Crown, and The Heir Apparent. All with that beautiful Daryl K. Sweet cover art, so popular back in the 80s and into the 90s. Um, some really interesting ideas for any Dungeons and Dragons campaign that uses kind of like a high fantasy setting, high magic, high fantasy setting. Um, they use a lot of the original D&D tropes. The magic system is very Vancian. A lot of the mechanics work that'll be in a way that are very familiar to Dungeons and Dragons players that you can kind of see superimposed into that world. And eventually were many of those books. Joel Rosenberg's passed away, but before he passed away, I'm thinking there were maybe as many as 10 of those books. And I don't know that I've actually read them all, but in any event, uh, just a suggestion I have. If you want to read that class of story, if you want to read about the players becoming uh, either transported to or entrapped in their game world, to my mind, those are the very best. Finally, the only suggestion I had, or that I wanted to talk about for the new Dungeon Masters inspirational reading list, the new Appendix D, they call it. And that is this book by Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces. It seemed to me like their list is based primarily on the idea of learning how to structure and write stories. And this is a great book if you want to understand, particularly from a mythic perspective, the story trope or idea of the hero's journey. The hero has an inciting incident which forces him to leave his home. He must go through struggles, triumph, and return home with new magic or knowledge beneficial to his home. And Joseph Campbell wrote this, many years ago, I believe in the 1940s. Let's make sure. But yes, an older book. Yeah, 1948. This is, I had a discussion not too long ago with some bookish friends, and we talked about books that really changed you, changed your outlook on life, changed your outlook on the world. And for me, this was one of the ones I thought about immediately. Um, this book gives you insight into how myth shapes every culture. It helps you identify the myths in our own current culture, um, and what the importance is of people having mythic stories and stories that give purpose to your life and can give you motivation. In another book by Joseph Campbell, which was basically a distillation of some interviews he did with a journalist called the Power of Myth, he makes a statement. He said, in many myths, you have a father who sacrifices himself for his son or his children, and said, and we can apply that in our own modern lives, because how often do people live those lives of quiet desperation that Thoreau talked about, um, where you're just trudging day by day to survive and support a family. And in many ways, it is a very heroic sacrifice. Many people are dying a little bit every day, but they're dying a little bit every day in hopes of giving a better future and a better life to their children. And that was a statement that has stuck with me ever since, about how, the lives we lead, even though they might not be the most exciting, they may not be the most um, personally fulfilling, but they can have purpose, and you can find purpose in your life. Um, but in any event, from this perspective, I'd like to include it in the new Dungeon Masters as an addition to the Dungeon Masters Appendix D for inspiration for Dungeon Masters and constructing stories and really understanding the heroic myth that is so much a part of the game, or can be. Anyway, I hope give you some things to think about. And just an announcement. This is the last video I will make from my place here, which I jokingly refer to as the van down by the river. My next video will most likely be recorded at my new cabin in the woods, making my own next step in a mythic hero's journey. But in any event, I will talk to you again soon, and thank you for watching.